welcome back to Okanagan Modified. Today's episode is going to be all about rebuilding a Chrysler LA360. And I'm not talking about just like refreshing an engine to put back in. I'm talking about building it for performance. And I'm also talking about doing that on a budget. Because let's face it, I'm a real Joe here, and I'm not going to spend $10,000 just to build a killer small block, but I'm going to build the best small block that I can on the budget that I have. And so we're going to do that together. So the LA360 engine, I've got one right here that's about to go to the machine shop. It made about 245 horsepower from the factory. And, I'm going to look for a goal of around 400. And I think that's quite reasonable to do on a budget. And I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. I think 400 horsepower would be a great sort of goal if we have to put a horsepower number to it. That'll make it plenty fun. The 8 3/4 rear end I have in the Dart is a 741 case, and so that is the smallest pinion gear on the Chrysler 8 3/4 rear end. So that's a little bit of a limiting factor there. If I were to put 600-700 horsepower into this car, then I got to start thinking about things like subframe connectors underneath to stiffen it up so that I don't actually twist the car. So, I mean, if I go ahead and I build something that has astronomical amounts of power, then I also need to do a lot of reinforcement. And then this car gets way beyond what it was intended for, and that's not the goal.
So the best engine you could have had back in 1970 from the factory in this car was a 340. Unfortunately, I don't have one. I have a 360 cubic inch engine. And the reality is it's really hard to get my hands on a 340. There are some out there, but they are astronomically priced. And the extra 20 cubic inches suits me just fine for the type of thing I'm going to be doing. I will be making up for all the shortcomings of the 360 and making a killer engine out of it. So, why would you get rid of an awesome performing 340 small block engine and go to a larger, lower performing 360? If you look at things that were happening at the time, it all makes sense. Chrysler engineers saw it coming. So did General Motors. You look at cars that Chevrolet had that had the 396 engine, basically they ended up becoming a 402. Chrysler did sort of the same thing here. They looked at the Chrysler engines that they had at the time. They needed to lower the compression because of emissions laws that were coming out, and they also knew that high performance cars had higher insurance premiums and people weren't going to be able to afford them anymore, and that was really going to hurt sales. So the muscle car era was dead. These cars were going to get things like catalytic converters added to them and air pumps added to them. So all things that are going to suck back on performance and help with emissions. And they needed to do something. So what they did was to compensate for these dished pistons that kill the compression, they increased the stroke. And that's how you got a 360 out of the Mopar small block and why they did it.
In the 70s, they had a drag racing class called Super Stock, and they had to maintain a lot of stock components, one in particular being the crankshaft had to remain stock, and that kept the cars on a more even playing field. And so guys had the liberty to port their heads, change the pistons, do all kinds of stuff, and bolt on a turbo or a supercharger, but they had to keep the crankshaft the way it was from the factory. So that way there'd be some sort of level playing field. And what that did was it taught everybody that these things are actually quite strong and quite capable. And so this is just a factory plain old Chrysler crankshaft. I have two of them, and I'll bring both of them to a machine shop and I'll have them tell me which one's the best for my build. This one here has already been machined 10 thousandths, and my other one hasn't been machined at all. But they both look to be excellent cranks and of the cast variety. and I'll just go with whichever one the professionals tell me I should use. And then I'm not going to be spending a lot of money on an expensive part that I really didn't need to replace in the first place. To stay on budget, I'm going to be reusing my factory connecting rods. They're another component that's plenty strong enough for the parameters that I'm hoping to be within. On this episode, we're going to listen to a little bit of Santana and some ZZ Top.
This is what I've removed. It's an Edelbrock Performer 318-360 manifold and an Edelbrock 1406 600 CFM carburetor. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this setup. It's just probably not going to take me where I want to be. This is designed for street use. It makes its power from idle to 5,500 RPM. And that's realistically where you're going to spend time on the street. What I'm going to is an Edelbrock Performer RPM series, also for the LA block. You can see it's a little bit taller of a manifold. It's a little bit designed more to modern standards. Its power band is from 1,500 to 6,500 RPM. And it basically gets such great reviews. Guys are claiming as much as 0.3 of a second in a quarter mile. Edelbrock says that it's outstanding high RPM performance. And that manifold also calls for a bigger carburetor, so I'm going to put my Holley 750 on it. And from the factory, these cars would have had cast iron manifolds, so the weight savings on these is incredible. I can literally just pick them up with one hand. I've also matched my ports to my new cylinder heads, which I'm going to show you in a little while. And that should be a nice sort of uninterrupted flow of the air-fuel mixture from one port into the other without any ugly ridges. To go through some big carburetor changes here, and I'll go over it with you. I took off a 600 CFM Edelbrock carb. It's part number 1406. It's been a great carburetor. I've got zero complaints about it. My new intake manifold is asking for 650 CFM or more. My new camshaft is asking for over 700. That's why I'm going to have to basically put this one on the shelf for now. It has smaller primaries. It has an electric choke. And it's been a great carburetor. What I've done is I've taken one of my Holleys that was a 650 and I've upgraded it to a 750 with an HP main body. So I had a carburetor just like this one with a restrictive choke without adjustable bleeds and with straight boosters. I took the Holley kit 134-300C. It was a really easy upgrade. Like a 5-year-old kid could do it. All you needed was a screwdriver and some basic tools. And this is what I got. So I've got a contoured main body with down leg drop boosters that are more sensitive. Should give me better response and overall performance. And there's actually adjustable air bleeds as well.
So if you're unsure of what size carburetor you should have, you can go online and there are hundreds of calculators for it, where you simply say your engine displacement in cubic inches and what your intended red line is and use of the engine, and it'll come up with a pretty close estimate of how many cubic feet per minute you should have. Then I want you to think about Mopars for a minute. They had 6-pack options on the small blocks and big blocks. Now, I could be wrong here, but that center carb I think was a 500 CFM, and then the edges were 300. And, you know, that's a hell of a lot of CFM for a small block especially. And it basically kind of throws the rules right out the window. The only difference between the small block 6-pack carbs and the big block 6-pack carbs is the jetting that they put inside them.
So I would have had to pay around $2,500 for a new set of aluminum cylinder heads ready to go. Just basically clean them up, take them out of the box, put a new head gasket on and go kind of thing. But I saved a hell of a lot of money. Spent about $300 or so on valve guides and about $300 on doing the machine work for upgrading to a 202-inch valve and installing hardened valve seats. And so, you know, that's a hell of a savings on a set of used heads. Seals are pretty darn cheap. I forget what they were, like $40-50 or something. And valve springs were about $155. And I already had the retainers. But all in all, pretty cheap. And so the first thing I did was I brought the heads to a machine shop and had them magnifluxed. Why bother doing any work if it's not a good core to start with? Once they told me it was alright, I went ahead and I did my gasket match like I did on my intake manifold. So I put a gasket over and I went ahead and I opened up the ports, removing all the obstructions. I did not make the ports really any bigger. I made the openings bigger to match, and I just blended them out. And it looked really good. And I did not go with like a super smooth finish because you want to have some sort of rough edge that's just like the factory casting. My work is pretty clean. Looking at the factory, all the obstruction in there to airflow. Little ridges, pitting. The next thing I did was polish up inside the exhaust ports and make it as smooth as I can. I got rid of all the bumps and ridges on that end so I can have a nice high flow exhaust going straight into my header. I did a little bit of a radius so that there's less of a turn for the air and exhaust come out. Another difference about these old engines from back in the day is that they ran on leaded fuel and they had no need for hardened valve seats like you would with unleaded fuel. So on my new cylinder heads, I've installed hardened valve seats, and that's on the exhaust side. Check out these pictures. Back in 1970, you could have went to the dealership and bought two identical cars. Let's say you bought two Plymouth Dusters with a 318, same transmission, same gear ratio, and you'd notice that one has a little bit better performance than the other one. Back in the day, they didn't have as good machining. Everything was cast, so I think that there's a lot of flaws in the casting. Like the cylinders were machined well, and the pistons were all the same. But I think a lot of the differences came from the fact that there was a lot of obstruction that was different in a lot of the castings. So, you know, removing that is a surefire way to gain performance. I did a bowl blend. There's a lot of bumps and ridges. Check out these pictures of my bowl blending. So I went ahead and I put in a 202-inch intake valve. What's really cool is they're nice and stainless, and these are stronger and lighter than the original ones. And I noticed that they're not sunken in to the seats like the factory ones were. So it probably actually tightens up my combustion chamber a little bit as well. One of my suspected problems on my old engine is that these are pretty puny looking valve springs. They look exactly like factory valve springs. I haven't tested them, but when you have a high lift cam, you need to have stiffer valve springs. And I had a high lift cam in that engine, and the valve springs looked like they weren't beefed up to match, and it probably ended up having valve float. Probably why it dogs so much at high RPM. So I've got comp cams, valve springs that I put in, and you can see they're literally twice the size in thickness, and machine shop set everything up so I'm good for about 525 lift. And my online research, guys are saying you're not going to benefit much more than 500 lift on a factory cast iron head, so there's not really much point putting a ginormous cam when it's not really going to increase the flow. While I had the cylinder heads at the machine shop, I had them install bronze valve guides. So I'm pretty stoked that I've gone and I've stepped up the performance of my cylinder head. The sucky thing is that they're still heavy because they're cast iron. I don't get any of the weight savings I could have got from going to an aluminum head. But really, for what it would cost me, I don't think it's worth it at this point. On the inside, I could have spent time and blended out the area around the valve guides, but I didn't want to get too carried away. I had already spent about 8 hours just doing my own little cleanup and porting on these things, and I didn't actually want to damage them, so I let that step be. So that was one more thing I could have done to increase the performance. Another thing I could have done was I could have opened up the area around the intake valve here. It's called deshrouding. Downside of that would be that I increased the size of the combustion chamber a little bit. I don't know how much that would factor in, and it would also risk me hitting the valve seat and causing some damage. So it was just an unnecessary risk that I didn't want to take being a rookie and doing this for the first time. I could have spent some money and had the head milled down a little bit, and then I would also have to have my intake manifold milled the equivalent so that they line up. And that would cost probably about $100 per head and $100 for the intake manifold. So that was a $300 hit that I didn't really think was necessary at this point. Could have got valves with a skinnier valve stem and then put in a skinnier valve guide. So these are the factory 3/8, and I decided to stick with that, partly because maybe someday I want to be able to interchange parts, and I just wanted to keep everything uniform in my garage, so I kept the 3/8 stems, but I could have gone to an 11/32 for the exact same price. Wouldn't have cost me anything different, and that might have gained a fraction more CFM out of the deal. One more thing I can think of to gain a little bit more out of these would be to put some roller rocker arms, but literally I've eaten up my budget already, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the factory ones that I have, and it's something that I can easily swap out later once the car's running. So, 2 years down the road, if I'm looking for a little bit more performance, then I can go ahead and try some roller rockers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find a piston that comes right up to zero deck, and I'm really looking into the Keith Black 107s at the moment. Regardless what brand I choose, I'm going to have a flat top piston, one that is not dished in. So these pistons, they remove about 5 cc, and that makes the combustion chamber bigger, and that makes the compression go down, that makes your performance go down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that right back up.
Could have put in a domed piston, but just to get that compression ratio up higher and sort of cheat a little bit on getting my power numbers way up. But you know what they say, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. I've got iron heads, and sort of the limited recommendation for that is about 10-1. I think that if you're going to be above that, you should have stronger head bolts and really good quality aluminum heads. And then you start getting higher up in the compression ratios. What you actually do is require higher octane fuel, and the whole purpose of this build was for me to be able to do it on regular pump gas. So 87 octane right up to 94 octane, and then just stop right there. So I don't want to be married to some sort of race fuel just to meet my dreams here. So I've chosen what I've chosen based on reliability and operability. And if it was all out performance, then I would have had to buy some aluminum heads and put an even more aggressive piston. You get to a point where you cross the line, like you get above 12.5 to 1 compression, and you might as well just keep going because you're on dedicated race fuel at that point. So, there's no more limit. So
how do I afford all these new parts? Well, truth is I'm not rich and I've had to part with something. And one thing that I'm letting go of is this interesting 1963 Yamaha YG1 Trailmaster. I mean, I found this bike and I instantly thought, wow, look at all that chrome, look at those curves. They don't make anything like that anymore. And I pretty much fell in love with this bike and brought it home. My goal was to give it a new paint job, find the missing parts, and ride it. And over the years, it just kind of got pushed around, collecting dust. And in total, I'm into this bike for about $324. So, I mean, I got a cool retro piece for a very small investment. And now I have someone coming to look at it and probably get around $700 for it. And so that's a hefty little profit for something that I didn't really put a lot into. I mean, it's sad because my friend helped me work on it, and kind of fun to get it running. It's hard not to get emotionally attached to cool retro pieces that you find and bring back from the dead. But, the reality is I want a set of new pistons, I want new bearings, got some machine work to pay for, and this is going to help me do that. And just like that, I sold the motorcycle, and I got a whole bunch of Sir Robert Bordens. Another thing that I'm going to do to save a little bit of money is reuse my push rods. I researched the absolute shit out of camshafts until I finally became comfortable with one that's going to be in this motor. And I'm not going to be reusing the cams that I previously had, and I'm going to get something totally new. What I want is to be able to make use of that intake manifold and carburetor that I have, and the fact that I've got a larger displacement in stock, and the fact that I've got flat top pistons going in, which is going to raise my compression to around 10 to 1, and the fact that I've got larger intake valves. I want to be able to get a little bit more in and out of those cylinder heads that I've also ported and polished. So the camshaft is totally crucial to that. So as I was researching cams, I came across this guy named Harold Brookshire, and he was making his own cams for a company called Ultradyne, and he also made cams for competition cams, and he was doing high energy series cams. And so he gave birth to a set of cams that had different load profiles than before, and that high energy series from comp is extremely popular for engines like this. And then Harold Brookshire went on to work for Lunati, and he started creating the Voodoo series camshafts, and find even more differences there. Basically more aggressive ramp up on the lobes, and a little bit more staggering. Unlike the old style camshafts that were like 474, 474, you can get them staggered. And so there's a whole modern grind aspect that comes from Harold Brookshire and some of these later additions to older engines. So I chose a camshaft called a Lunati Voodoo cam, and I call it the 703 because those are the last three digits. And it's got 268, 276 duration at 50, 226, 234 lift, and max lift of 494 and 513, and 110 lobe separation angle. And so everybody who's put a cam in a car like this has just loved it. And Joe Lunati was a racer himself. He would literally have his own cams ground up, do it himself, race it. And he was a businessman, and his company eventually sold to Holley. So if you're buying something from a Holley-owned company, it's not going to be a piece of shit.
And so, the Lunati cam is going to be, a well-established legendary piece, with sort of a modern grind that's going to bring aspects to this car that it wouldn't have had I chosen, an old retro cam. Thing is, when you order a new cam, you have to go with new lifters. You can't just put an old set of lifters on a brand new cam. It doesn't work that way. So I made a list of all the camshafts that would be seemingly great for this car. And, a lot of them had that sort of 268 duration. And I saw that in common with a lot of them. And this Lunati also shared that value. And I used to think, when I used to look at camshafts, being young and ignorant, I would say like, oh, what's the lift on that thing? What's the lift on that thing? It was always about, what the maximum was. And, truth be told, that is not the most important factor in selecting a camshaft. Everything really factors in. And so I've done so much research on this, and then I brought it to my machine shop that's got my engine block, and I showed him, my top 3 favorite camshafts, and he totally agreed that the Lunati Voodoo series cam would be the absolute one that I would want. So I went ahead and I ordered it because I've got so much guidance in it and intuition in it, and so many hundreds of hours of research, and I think it's really going to kick some ass. This entire time I've been drawn towards competition cam's big mother thumper, because I absolutely love the classic muscle car sound, and they also make a cam called the Nostalgia Plus cam, and that gives that traditional 60s and 70s thumpy idle. And I was very close to selecting one of those, but I saw that they still ended up giving up a little bit of performance to the Lunati Voodoo cam, and so I chose all out performance over that boom boom idle. So I don't think I'm going to regret it though, because this is still going to have a pretty sick idle. I just want a new mechanical oil pump, and even though both of mine didn't seem to look like there's anything wrong with them and they function just fine, I'm going to go ahead and buy a new one, because that's what you do. You don't just put an old one in that you don't know how long it's going to last. And so, those range from about $50 to $80 for a regular one, and over $100 for a high flow one. Another thing I'm going to do is not reuse the timing chain, and there goes another $100 or so, just like that. And of course, going to need all new rod bearings, crank bearings, all new gaskets top to bottom. Going to need oil pan gaskets, fuel pump gaskets, water pump gaskets, cylinder head gaskets, intake manifold gaskets, exhaust manifold gaskets. So, there's at least $350 worth of gaskets alone. So if you're even just doing a quick little refresh on an engine, you're a couple $100 in before you even started. And that wraps up today's episode. You can see my engine stand has nothing on it because the engine block has gone to the machine shop. It's going to get its cylinders bored and refreshed. It's going to get inspected, and I'm going to have new pistons put on those connecting rods, and then I'll bring it all home and start putting it back together. In the meantime, the next episode is going to be all about continuing to make this car prettier and ready to accept that engine. So you can stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching.